The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, somewhere over the Hindu Kush mountains of Afghanistan. Lieutenant Colonel Zara, Phantom, Volkov pressed her headset closer to her ear, straining to hear the transmission through the electronic warfare jamming that had been plaguing their frequencies for the past 6 hours. What she heard made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Reaper 6-1. We are going down. Repeat, we are going down. Grid coordinates 37 Tango Foxtrot 9 rate. We have wounded. We need immediate extraction. How copy?" The voice belonged to Master Chief Petty Officer Jackson, Bulldog, Martinez, a man she'd never met but whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. Martinez led one of the most elite SEAL teams in the Pacific Theater, a group of operators so skilled they were whispered about in the same breath as ghost stories. If Martinez was calling Mayday, something had gone catastrophically wrong in the mountains below. Phantom banked her, Thunderbolt II through a knife-edge turn, the twin engines growling like caged wolves as she descended toward the coordinates. The aircraft's titanium bathtub cockpit surrounded her like armor, but she felt exposed nonetheless. Below her, the Afghan landscape stretched endlessly, all jagged peaks and hidden valleys where death waited behind every ridgeline. Her hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, fingers dancing over switches and dials that had become extensions of her own nervous system after 14 years of flying close air support missions. The irony wasn't lost on her that 6 months ago, these same SEALs had laughed when she'd volunteered for the most dangerous extraction mission of her career. They'd looked at her 5'4" frame, her quiet demeanor, and assumed she was just another desk pilot playing war games. "No pilot could survive that dive through Devil's Canyon," Martinez had said, shaking his head. "Especially not some Air Force princess who's never seen real combat." Now Martinez was bleeding out somewhere in those same mountains, and she was the only pilot within 100 miles crazy enough to attempt what everyone else called a suicide mission. The canyon he'd referenced wasn't just dangerous. It was a death trap, a narrow gorge barely wider than her aircraft's wingspan, with walls that scraped the sky and winds that could slam a fighter jet into solid rock before the pilot even knew what hit them. Phantom checked her fuel gauge, calculated her remaining flight time, and made a decision that would either save 8 American lives or add her name to the growing list of casualties in this endless war. "Reaper 6-1, this is Phantom. I'm coming for you." The radio fell silent, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen when an unstoppable force met an immovable object at 300 miles per hour. Far below, Martinez pressed his hand against a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding and wondered if he just heard the voice of an angel or a fool. Time would tell which one was flying to their rescue through the darkness before dawn. In the pre-dawn gloom, Phantom's A-10 looked like a harbinger of death, its twin engines leaving contrails against the star-filled sky. She had no way of knowing that this moment would become legend, that years later, young pilots would study the flight recorder data from this mission and shake their heads in disbelief. All she knew was that 8 Americans needed her, and she had never failed to answer that call. The mountains rose up to meet her like the teeth of some ancient beast, and Lieutenant Colonel Zara Volkov flew straight into its mouth without hesitation. Below, in a hidden valley where shadows still ruled despite the approaching dawn, 8 wounded SEALs waited for a miracle they weren't sure they deserved. Above them, that miracle was about to attempt something that would redefine the very concept of impossible. What happened next would be talked about in military circles for decades to come, a story that grew more incredible with each telling, until some began to wonder if it had really happened at all. But for the 8 men bleeding out in Devil's Canyon, it was the most real thing they'd ever experienced. The sound of salvation cutting through the Afghan sky at full throttle, piloted by a woman they'd underestimated and would never forget. The mission clock started now. Every second mattered. Every decision carried the weight of 8 lives hanging in the balance, suspended between hope and despair like morning mist clinging to mountain peaks. Phantom throttled up, her engine screaming defiance at the laws of physics and the limitations of human courage, and dove toward a canyon that had already claimed 17 aircraft in the past 2 years. She was about to make it 18, or prove that some people are born to rewrite the rules of what's possible when everything depends on getting it exactly right the first time. There would be no second chances, no do-overs, no margin for error. Just skill, determination, and the kind of courage that only emerges when ordinary people are asked to do extraordinary things. The radio crackled again. Martinez's voice, weaker now but still fighting. "Phantom, be advised we have heavy enemy contact. Repeat, heavy enemy contact. They know you're coming." She smiled grimly behind her oxygen mask. Let them come. She'd been preparing for this moment her entire military career without even knowing it. Every training flight, every combat mission, every sleepless night studying aircraft performance parameters and emergency procedures had led her to this. One shot to prove that the impossible was just another word for something nobody had been brave enough to attempt yet. The first surface-to-air missile streaked past her canopy like an angry meteor, close enough that she could see the Soviet markings on its warhead. Phantom rolled inverted, pulled negative GS that would have made lesser pilots black out, and dove deeper into the canyon system, where the real test was about to begin. The mountains closed around her like a fist, and for the next 20 minutes, the laws of physics and the limits of human endurance would be pushed beyond their breaking point. 8 American warriors waited for her arrival. 8 families back home waited for news they prayed would never come. And one woman who'd spent her entire career being told she wasn't strong enough, fast enough, or brave enough to fly with the big boys, was about to show them all what real strength looked like when everything was on the line. Down in the valley, Martinez checked his watch and closed his eyes. If Phantom was coming, she'd be here soon. If she wasn't, well, they'd fought the good fight and could die knowing they'd given everything they had. Either way, the waiting was almost over. The only question now was whether their guardian angel had wings strong enough to carry them all home. The sound of twin turbofan engines echoed off canyon walls like thunder, growing louder with each passing second. Martinez opened his eyes and managed a weak smile. Phantom was coming after all. Whether she could pull off the impossible remained to be seen, but she was coming, and sometimes that was enough to tip the scales between victory and defeat, between coming home and being buried in foreign soil under a flag-draped coffin. The real story was just beginning, and it would be told around military campfires for generations to come. The night a pilot they dismissed as too small, too quiet, and too untested flew into the mouth of hell and emerged with 8 of America's finest warriors. But first, she had to survive the next 20 minutes, and that was going to take everything she had and then some. The canyon walls rushed past her cockpit windows like a blur of stone and shadow, and Phantom began her descent into the most dangerous piece of airspace in Afghanistan, where angels feared to tread and only the truly exceptional had any hope of survival. The clock was ticking, the enemy was waiting, and 8 lives hung in the balance. Everything else was just details. Martinez's team had been conducting a high-value target elimination mission when everything went sideways. Intelligence had indicated light resistance, maybe a handful of Taliban fighters guarding an arms cache in a remote valley. What they found instead was a full company of battle-hardened fighters with military-grade weapons and the tactical knowledge to use them effectively. The SEALs had completed their objective, destroyed the weapons cache, and were moving to their extraction point when the ambush began. Now they were pinned down in terrain that offered minimal cover, with 2 critically wounded team members and ammunition running dangerously low. Their emergency beacon was broadcasting on all frequencies, but standard extraction protocols called for helicopter support, and the nearest aviation assets were 3 hours away. By then, Martinez knew they'd all be either captured or dead. That's when Phantom's voice had cut through the static like a sword through silk, calm and professional despite the impossible nature of what she was volunteering to attempt. Martinez had heard about her during pre-deployment briefings, the Air Force pilot who'd requested assignment to the most dangerous combat zones, who flew close air support missions that other pilots refused to touch, who had a reputation for getting everyone home no matter what the odds. But reputation and reality were two different things, especially when reality involved threading a $30 million aircraft through a canyon system that had been designed by geology and defended by gravity. The Devil's Canyon approach required precision flying that bordered on the supernatural, and even if Phantom could navigate the terrain, she'd still have to deal with enemy fire from positions that commanded perfect fields of view. Martinez pressed his back against the rocky outcropping that provided their only protection and watched his team's medic work frantically to stabilize their wounded. Time was running out faster than water through a broken dam, and their only hope was flying toward them through airspace that had claimed more American lives than any other piece of real estate in the entire theater of operations. High above, Phantom ran through her final systems checks, her hands moving with the fluid precision of someone who'd performed these same motions thousands of times. Fuel levels, weapon status, communications equipment, ejection seat, everything showed green across the board, which was somehow more terrifying than if something had been malfunctioning. When all systems showed optimal performance, there was no excuse for failure except human error, and human error in this environment meant death. She'd studied the canyon system during countless sleepless nights, memorizing every twist and turn, every thermal updraft and wind shear point. She knew that the approach required a descent angle that would push her aircraft to the very edge of structural failure, that the margin for error was measured in inches rather than feet, and that if anything went wrong during the final approach, there would be no time to eject, no chance to abort, and no possibility of survival. None of that mattered now. 8 Americans were counting on her, and she'd never failed to answer that call. The mission parameters were simple: get in, provide close air support to suppress enemy fire, and create an opening for helicopter extraction. The execution would be anything but simple, requiring split-second timing, perfect coordination with ground forces, and flying skills that existed at the very limits of human capability. Phantom keyed her radio one final time before beginning her descent. Reaper 6-1, this is Phantom. Beginning approach run. Mark your position with infrared strobes and keep your heads down. This is going to get interesting. Martinez almost laughed despite their desperate situation. Interesting was one way to put it. Suicidal was probably more accurate. But as he activated the team's emergency beacon and watched his wounded teammates fight to stay conscious, he found himself believing that maybe, just maybe, they were about to witness something that would redefine the possible. The sound of Phantom's engines grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls like the approach of Judgment Day. Martinez closed his eyes and said a prayer he hadn't spoken since childhood, asking for strength, courage, and the kind of divine intervention that came disguised as military training and unshakable determination. When he opened his eyes, he could see the first faint glow of dawn touching the eastern peaks. If they lived through the next few minutes, it was going to be a beautiful morning. If they didn't, at least they'd go out fighting alongside someone who exemplified everything the American military stood for: courage under fire, dedication to mission accomplishment, and absolute refusal to leave anyone behind. The canyon walls began to vibrate with the harmonic resonance of twin turbofan engines operating at maximum power settings, and Master Chief Martinez prepared to witness either the most spectacular rescue in military aviation history or the most heroic failure. Either way, he was about to see what happened when an ordinary human being decided to attempt something extraordinary, regardless of the personal cost. Phantom's A-10 appeared above the canyon rim like an avenging angel, silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky, and began its descent into hell itself. The real story was about to begin, and it would be written in smoke trails and muzzle flashes, in the steady beat of Phantom's heart, and the unwavering focus of her combat-trained mind, in the space between one heartbeat and the next where heroes are born and legends take flight. The first enemy rounds began impacting around her aircraft as she dropped below the canyon rim, and Lieutenant Colonel Zara, Phantom, Volkov smiled behind her oxygen mask. She was exactly where she belonged, in the middle of an impossible mission, flying an aircraft pushed to its absolute limits, fighting to bring 8 of America's finest warriors home alive. Everything else was just background noise. Time slowed to a crawl as Phantom entered the canyon system, her aircraft's titanium armor deflecting small arms fire that sparkled like deadly fireworks in the growing dawn light. Below her, 8 SEALs watched in amazement as their salvation screamed toward them at 300 miles per hour, defying gravity, logic, and every conventional wisdom about what was possible in the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan. This was their moment. This was why they'd trained, why they'd volunteered for the most dangerous missions, why they'd pushed themselves beyond normal human limitations. Not for glory or recognition, but for moments like this when everything hung in the balance and only the extraordinary would suffice. Phantom was about to show them all what extraordinary really looked like when the stakes couldn't be higher and failure wasn't an option. The canyon walls rushed past like a stone river flowing backward, and the sound of salvation echoed off ancient rock formations that had witnessed countless battles but never anything quite like this. History was being made in real time, one heartbeat at a time, by people who'd never expected to become legends, but found themselves rewriting the definition of courage under fire. 8 lives, 1 pilot, 20 minutes of flight time. The mathematics of survival had never been more brutally simple or more dependent on human excellence achieving the impossible when everything that mattered hung in the balance. Phantom's hands were steady on the controls, her breathing was controlled and rhythmic, and her eyes never wavered from the target coordinates where her fellow warriors waited for their one chance at seeing home again. The dive continued, deeper into terrain that challenged every assumption about what aircraft could survive and what pilots could accomplish when ordinary just wasn't enough. Below, Martinez held his breath and prepared to witness either a miracle or a tragedy, knowing that either way, he was about to see something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Thunder echoed off the canyon walls as Phantom's engines roared defiance at the laws of physics, and the most dangerous extraction mission in military aviation history entered its final phase. What happened next would be studied, analyzed, and remembered long after the participants had returned to civilian life, because some moments transcend their immediate circumstances and become part of the eternal story of human courage under fire. The radio crackled with updates, status reports, and coordinates, but beneath all the technical chatter was something more fundamental, the sound of professionals doing their jobs under impossible circumstances, refusing to quit when quitting would have been the reasonable choice. Phantom was committed now, her aircraft locked into a descent profile that would either deliver salvation or ensure that 9 American heroes would be buried together in the mountains of Afghanistan. Martinez watched the sky and waited for either deliverance or doom, knowing that he was about to witness the kind of moment that defined not just individual careers, but the entire ethos of military service, the absolute refusal to leave anyone behind, regardless of the personal cost or the mathematical probability of success. Far above, stars faded into morning light, and somewhere in the distance, helicopter rescue teams were spinning up their rotors and calculating flight times to coordinates they prayed would still contain living Americans when they arrived. But for now, everything depended on one pilot, one aircraft, and the kind of courage that only emerged when the impossible became the only acceptable option. The descent continued, and with each passing second, the margin between success and catastrophic failure grew thinner, until only skill, determination, and divine providence stood between 8 American warriors and their final mission. Phantom had accepted those odds without hesitation, and now she was about to prove that sometimes, just sometimes, The impossible was simply another word for something that hadn't been accomplished yet. Phantom's hands moved across the controls with surgical precision as she navigated the first major turn in the canyon system. Her aircraft's wings mere feet from vertical rock walls that had been carved by millions of years of geological violence. The A-10's design specifications never anticipated maneuvers like this, banking angles that stressed the airframe beyond normal operational limits, G-forces that pushed both pilot and machine into uncharted territory, where margin for error was measured in millimeters and milliseconds. Her flight computer screamed warnings that she ignored with practiced efficiency. Altitude alerts, structural stress indicators, proximity alarms, all background noise compared to the steady rhythm of her breathing and the crystalline focus that came from years of training for exactly this moment. Every emergency procedure, every simulator session, every sleepless night studying aircraft performance data had prepared her for 20 minutes of flying that would either validate her entire career or end it in spectacular fashion. Below, Martinez's team had spread into defensive positions among the rocky outcroppings that provided minimal cover from the hostile fire. Their ammunition was running critically low, with each team member down to their last 2 magazines. The wounded were barely conscious, their life signs weakening with each passing minute. If Phantom couldn't create the tactical opening they needed for helicopter extraction, the mission would end the way too many had ended in these mountains, with flag-draped coffins and families forever changed by the mathematics of modern warfare. The enemy had chosen their ambush site with professional precision. Overlapping fields of fire, multiple exit routes, terrain that channeled any rescue attempt through predetermined kill zones. They'd studied American tactics, understood American capabilities, and prepared countermeasures designed to turn this remote valley into a death trap for anyone foolish enough to enter. What they hadn't prepared for was a pilot crazy enough to attempt an approach that violated every principle of tactical aviation and common sense. Phantom could see muzzle flashes from enemy positions as she descended deeper into the canyon, pinpoints of light that marked the location of fighters determined to prevent any American from leaving this valley alive. Her targeting systems locked onto the heat signatures, calculating firing solutions with computer precision, while her human brain processed the tactical picture with intuitive understanding that no machine could replicate. She had one pass, maybe two if the gods of combat smiled upon her, to eliminate enough threats to create the window Martinez needed. The first surface-to-air missile streaked past her canopy close enough to rattle her teeth, followed immediately by a second that detonated just behind her left engine. Shrapnel peppered the titanium armor surrounding her cockpit, creating a sound like deadly hail against metal. Warning lights illuminated across her instrument panel, but the engines continued their steady roar, and her flight controls remained responsive. The A-10 had been designed to absorb punishment that would destroy lesser aircraft, and today that design philosophy was being tested under combat conditions that exceeded every engineering specification. Martinez watched in amazement as Phantom's aircraft absorbed hostile fire that should have been fatal, her pilot's skill evident in every subtle adjustment of angle and altitude. He'd seen close air support before, had called in strikes from every type of aircraft in the American arsenal, but he'd never seen anything like this. A pilot deliberately entering terrain that offered no escape route, no margin for error, and no possibility of survival if anything went wrong. The sound of her 13 GAU-8 Avenger cannon opening fire filled the canyon like the voice of an angry god, each round traveling at nearly 3 times the speed of sound, and carrying enough kinetic energy to destroy light vehicles and fortified positions. Her targeting was surgical, precise, eliminating threats with minimum collateral damage while preserving the tactical integrity of the extraction zone. Dust and debris erupted from enemy positions as high-explosive rounds found their marks with devastating accuracy. In the space of 30 seconds, Phantom had fundamentally altered the tactical situation, suppressing enough hostile fire to give Martinez's team the breathing room they needed. But her aircraft had paid the price. Multiple warning lights indicated damage to hydraulic systems, partial loss of flight control authority, and fuel leaks that were measurable but not yet critical. She was flying on borrowed time in borrowed airspace, her margin for error shrinking with each passing second. The radio crackled with updates from inbound helicopter assets, still 20 minutes out but closing fast on coordinates that had become the focal point for the most complex rescue operation mounted in this sector in months. Phantom's initial strike had created the tactical opening, but sustaining it would require her to remain in the kill zone far longer than any sane pilot would consider acceptable. She keyed her microphone without hesitation. Reaper 6-1 Phantom. First pass complete, threats suppressed but not eliminated. Be advised, I'm staying in the area until your ride arrives. Keep those IR strobes active and be ready to move on my signal. Martinez couldn't believe what he was hearing. Standard close air support protocols called for strike aircraft to make their attack runs and immediately exit the area to avoid becoming targets themselves. Phantom was volunteering to orbit in a confined canyon system while taking continuous hostile fire, essentially painting a target on her aircraft and daring the enemy to take their best shot. It was tactically unsound, strategically questionable, and absolutely the only thing that might keep his team alive long enough for helicopter extraction. Her second pass was even more aggressive than the first, her A-10 screaming through the canyon at minimum altitude while engaging targets that had repositioned after her initial attack. The enemy had learned from their first encounter, spreading out to minimize the effectiveness of her area weapons and concentrating their fire to maximize the probability of a catastrophic hit. Phantom responded by flying lower, faster, and with even greater precision, her aircraft dancing between hostile tracers like a deadly ballet performed at the edge of human capability. The third missile that found its mark was the one that changed everything. It detonated against her right engine nacelle with enough force to send shrapnel through the cockpit, creating a spider web of cracks across her canopy and filling the air with smoke and the acrid smell of burning electronics. Her right engine wound down with a mechanical shriek that sounded like death itself, leaving her flying on single-engine power in terrain that demanded everything both engines could provide. Warning lights bathed her cockpit in crimson illumination as multiple systems failed simultaneously, but Phantom's training took over where conscious thought left off. Emergency checklists executed from muscle memory, power settings adjusted to compensate for lost thrust, flight control inputs that kept her aircraft stable despite catastrophic damage. She was flying a machine that should have been unflyable, in airspace that should have been unsurvivable, attempting a mission that should have been impossible. Below, Martinez watched smoke trail from Phantom's damaged aircraft and felt his heart sink. She was hit, badly hit, but she was still flying, still fighting, still providing the covering fire that kept his team alive. Her radio transmissions remained calm and professional despite circumstances that would have broken lesser pilots, her voice steady as she coordinated with the inbound helicopter team that represented their only hope of evacuation. The damaged A-10 completed another orbit of the canyon, its pilot pushing the aircraft beyond every reasonable limit to maintain the tactical situation until rescue arrived. Fuel was becoming critical. Engine parameters showed readings that should have triggered an immediate emergency landing, and structural damage was accumulating with each maneuver. But Phantom's determination was absolute, unshakable, and evident in every precisely calculated gun run that eliminated threats and preserved options. Martinez keyed his radio, his voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to express. "Phantom, Reaper 6-1, you're taking heavy damage up there. We can hold position until the helicopters arrive. You need to think about getting yourself out of here while you still can." Her response came without hesitation, delivered in the same calm tone she'd maintained throughout the engagement. Negative, Reaper 6-1. I'm staying with you until everyone's on their way home. That's not negotiable. It was in that moment that Martinez understood he was witnessing something extraordinary, something that transcended normal definitions of courage and duty. Phantom wasn't just providing close air support. She was demonstrating the absolute commitment to mission accomplishment and care for subordinates that defined the finest traditions of American military service. She was risking everything, sacrificing her own safety without question or hesitation, because 8 American warriors needed her, and she had never failed to answer that call. The canyon walls echoed with the sound of damaged turbofan engines operating at emergency power settings, mixed with the percussion of small arms fire and the distinctive crack of her 30 cannon. Somewhere in that cacophony of combat was the rhythm of heroism being written in real time, one heartbeat at a time, by a pilot who'd been underestimated and was now proving that courage had nothing to do with size, gender, or anyone else's expectations. High above, the first helicopter appeared on the horizon, its rotor blades beating the air like mechanical wings carrying salvation. But between that helicopter and the 8 men who needed rescue lay 20 more minutes of the most dangerous flying in modern military aviation, piloted by a woman who'd already pushed beyond every conceivable limit and showed no signs of stopping until every last American was safely out of harm's way. The sun crested the eastern peaks, flooding the canyon with golden light that illuminated the smoke trails from Phantom's damaged aircraft. Dawn had come to Afghanistan, and with it, the final phase of a rescue mission that would be remembered long after the participants had returned to their families and the mountains had claimed new victims. But for now, in this moment, 8 Americans lived because one pilot had decided that impossible was just another word for something worth attempting when lives hung in the balance. Martinez pressed his back against the rock and watched his guardian angel circle overhead on failing engines, her aircraft trailing smoke but her resolve absolutely unshakable. In a few minutes, he would learn her real name, her service record, and the personal story that had forged the kind of courage he was witnessing. But for now, she was simply Phantom, the pilot who'd answered their distress call and proved that heroes weren't born. They were revealed when circumstances demanded the extraordinary from ordinary people who refused to quit. The helicopter's rotors grew louder with each passing second, and somewhere in that growing sound was the promise of home, family, and futures that had seemed impossible just an hour before. But first, they had to survive the next few minutes, and that would require Phantom to continue performing miracles in an aircraft that was barely flyable, in airspace that had already claimed too many American lives, against odds that favored anyone except the people who needed the impossible to become possible. The final act was about to begin, and it would determine whether this story ended in triumph or tragedy, whether 8 families would welcome their warriors home or receive folded flags and condolences. Everything depended on a pilot who'd spent her career being told she wasn't strong enough, fast enough, or tough enough to fly with the elite, and was now demonstrating that real strength came from within, measured not in physical capability, but in the absolute refusal to abandon fellow Americans when they needed her most. The inbound helicopter team could see smoke rising from the canyon system as they approached the extraction coordinates, their crew chiefs readying fast ropes and medical equipment for what promised to be one of the most challenging rescue operations in recent memory. They'd been briefed on the tactical situation, understood the risks, and knew that their success depended entirely on an Air Force pilot who was currently performing aerial maneuvers that existed at the very edge of what was physically possible. Phantom's fuel gauges showed readings that would have triggered emergency procedures under normal circumstances, but nothing about this mission fell within normal parameters. She was flying on vapors and determination, her damaged aircraft held together by engineering excellence and pilot skill that had been forged in the crucible of combat experience. Every system that could fail had failed, every backup that could be compromised was compromised, and yet she continued to orbit the canyon with mechanical precision, her cannons silencing enemy positions with surgical accuracy. The helicopter crew could hear her radio transmissions as they closed on the extraction zone, her voice calm and professional despite circumstances that would have broken lesser pilots. She was coordinating the approach, identifying landing zones, and maintaining suppressive fire against hostile positions, all while flying an aircraft that should have been in a controlled crash landing, not conducting close air support operations in terrain that challenged the limits of aerodynamic possibility. Martinez watched the helicopter appear above the canyon rim and felt hope surge through his chest like electricity. They were going to make it. Against all odds, despite impossible circumstances, they were actually going to make it home. But his elation was tempered by concern for the pilot who'd made their survival possible. Phantom's aircraft was trailing more smoke now, her engine parameters clearly indicating catastrophic damage, and her fuel situation had to be approaching critical levels. The helicopter's crew chief surveyed the tactical situation through his door-mounted machine gun sight and whistled under his breath. He'd participated in hundreds of rescue operations, had extracted teams from hostile territory under every conceivable circumstance, but he'd never seen anything like this. The canyon was barely wide enough for their aircraft. The landing zone was under sporadic hostile fire, and overhead, an A-10 with obvious battle damage was providing covering fire despite conditions that should have sent any rational pilot toward the nearest emergency landing strip. Phantom keyed her radio as the helicopter began its descent toward Martinez's position. Rescue 6-7, Phantom. LZ is hot but manageable. I'll maintain overwatch during extraction. Be advised, my fuel state is critical, so let's make this fast and clean. The understatement was so profound, it was almost funny. Critical didn't begin to describe her fuel situation. Her gauges showed levels that indicated perhaps 10 minutes of flight time remaining, possibly less depending on power settings and maneuvering requirements. She was operating on borrowed time in borrowed airspace, her survival dependent on factors that were largely beyond her control. But control had always been relative in combat aviation, and Phantom had learned long ago that the only thing pilots could truly control was their own response to circumstances beyond their influence. She could control her breathing, her focus, her decision-making process, and her absolute commitment to mission accomplishment. Everything else, mechanical failures, hostile fire, fuel consumption, and the laws of physics, were variables to be managed, not obstacles to surrender to. The helicopter settled into a hover above the extraction point, its rotor wash creating a dust storm that obscured visibility but provided concealment from enemy positions. Fast ropes deployed from both sides of the aircraft, and within seconds, the crew chief and 2 rescue specialists were on the ground, moving with practiced efficiency toward Martinez's team. They had perhaps 3 minutes to load 8 men, including 2 stretcher cases, before hostile fire would force them to abort the attempt. Phantom orbited overhead, her damaged aircraft bucking and shuddering with each maneuver, but responding to her control inputs with the reliability that had made the A-10 legendary among ground forces. Her cannon continued to speak at precisely calculated intervals, each burst eliminating threats and preserving the tactical integrity of the extraction zone. She was writing a textbook example of close air support doctrine in real time, demonstrating what was possible when superior training met absolute determination. The first casualties were loaded aboard the helicopter with efficient medical precision, their wounds stabilized enough for transport, but requiring immediate surgical intervention that could only be provided at the nearest forward operating base. Martinez supervised the evacuation with the calm authority that had made him one of the most respected operators in the special operations community, ensuring that no equipment was left behind, and no man was forgotten in the controlled chaos of combat extraction. Phantom's voice cut through the radio chatter with information that changed the entire dynamic of the operation. All stations, Phantom. Be advised, I'm showing large enemy force movement from the north. Estimate company strength with heavy weapons, approximately 10 minutes from your position. Recommend expedited extraction. The tactical picture had just become exponentially more complicated. A company of enemy fighters meant overwhelming odds that could turn a successful rescue into a catastrophic defeat. The helicopter crew increased their pace, but loading wounded men in a confined space under hostile fire was a process that couldn't be rushed without risking additional casualties. They needed time that they didn't have, protected by a pilot whose aircraft was approaching the absolute limits of mechanical survival. Martinez made the decision that defined his character and validated his reputation as one of America's finest combat leaders. He would be the last man out, ensuring that every member of his team was safely aboard before he left the ground. It was standard operating procedure for special operations, but in this case, it meant trusting his life to a pilot who was performing miracles in an aircraft that defied every reasonable expectation of continued flight capability. The helicopter lifted off with 7 men aboard, leaving Martinez and his wounded teammate on the ground for a second extraction that would have to be accomplished with even greater speed and precision. Phantom adjusted her orbit to compensate for the changed tactical situation, her damaged aircraft somehow finding reserve power that shouldn't have existed to maintain the covering fire that kept hostile forces at bay. Her engine temperature readings showed levels that should have triggered automatic shutdown procedures, but she had overridden the safety systems and was operating on power settings that existed beyond normal engineering parameters. Metal fatigue, thermal stress, and accumulated battle damage were pushing both pilot and machine toward a breaking point that approached with mathematical certainty. But breaking points were relative concepts when mission accomplishment depended on exceeding normal limitations. The helicopter's second approach was even more dangerous than the first, with enemy forces closing from multiple directions and Phantom's fuel state approaching levels that made continued flight increasingly doubtful. But doubt was a luxury that none of them could afford. Martinez needed extraction, the helicopter crew needed covering fire, and Phantom needed to prove that some things mattered more than personal survival or mechanical limitations. Her final gun run was a masterpiece of tactical aviation, delivered with precision that existed at the intersection of superior training and absolute commitment to mission success. The 13 cannon spoke with authority that silenced enemy positions and created the tactical window needed for Martinez's extraction, but the effort cost her aircraft the last reserves of power and structural integrity that had kept them airborne. As Martinez climbed aboard the helicopter, he looked up to see Phantom's A-10 trailing heavy smoke from both engines, its pilot having sacrificed her aircraft's survival to ensure the success of their mission. She had given everything: fuel, structural integrity, engine life, and personal safety to bring 8 American warriors home alive. What happened next would determine whether her sacrifice had been worthwhile, or whether it would simply add one more name to the casualty lists that grew longer with each passing day. The helicopter climbed toward the canyon rim with Martinez safely aboard, its crew scanning the sky for any sign of Phantom's aircraft. They found her limping toward the nearest emergency landing strip on power settings that existed in the red zones of every performance chart, her voice still calm on the radio as she coordinated with recovery teams and reported her mechanical status with professional detachment that masked the severity of her situation. Martinez keyed his radio for what he thought might be the last time. "Phantom, Reaper 6-1, we're all accounted for and headed home. I don't know how to thank you for what you did today." Her response came without hesitation, delivered in the same steady tone that had characterized every transmission throughout their ordeal. "No thanks necessary, Reaper 6-1. It's what we do. Take care of your people and get them home to their families."